Jesus took with him Peter and James and John to the mountaintop. I'm sure that for Peter and for the others, this invitation to follow Jesus up the mountain was an invitation for them to enter quite personally into that moment of encounter with God. They knew that the mountain was the domain of the sacred, that here God would be present to them. And so they may have accepted that invitation with great excitement and perhaps with a little trepidation as well. But they went. Jesus led them up that mountain where they could be alone. If only they could indeed be alone in that place of the sacred. Little did they realize what this mountaintop experience would bring to them in the ordinary, everyday lives. It was here that Jesus would be transfigured in their presence. This moment of the transfiguration is one of those signature moments, not only in the story of Jesus and his disciples, but it's one of those moments that marks the very essence of God's action in God's plan of salvation for the world. Perhaps the first sacred moment took place when Jesus was baptized and God spoke. "You are my son," God had said to Jesus. "My favor rests on you." Now on that mountaintop, Peter and James and John, they would now experience this next sacred moment as God would speak again. "This is my son," God said to the disciples. Listen to him. Now that would have been more than enough for these ordinary fishermen who had chosen to enter into this journey up the mountain, to experience this moment of encounter that seemed to be at the very heart of Jesus' own life and his ministry. Time and again, Jesus would set off by himself. He would head up to the mountain to pray. He would go off to be in the presence of God, his Abba, Father. And it was on the mountain that God would be present to him. This time, in that sacred moment, Peter and James and John, they had now been included. They would encounter the very presence of God in their mountaintop experience. But then there'd been so much more to this encounter than they had perhaps anticipated. As Jesus was transfigured, as he became as bright as light, the disciples then saw Moses and Elijah standing in the glow of that light emanating from Jesus himself, and they were speaking to him. This was a moment to be savored. It was a moment that rarely happens in the lives of everyday people. The disciples were perhaps in awe of all that was happening to them that day on the mountaintop. They'd seen this man Jesus, the one who had called them, the one that they had chosen to follow. They would now see him in a very different light, and they'd be amazed at what was happening in front of them. Here indeed was a moment to experience. Here was a place to perhaps stay and stay, where God is present, where such prayer experience has enormous power. So Peter said, let's make 3 tents and stay here on the mountaintop to simply be amazed at all that was taking place. It is wonderful for us to be here, Peter and James and John had said. But this was a moment, a sacred moment of encounter between Jesus and God and the disciples. But it was exactly that, just a moment in their journey of faith. The disciples had seen and heard all that had taken place that day, and it would be an experience that these ordinary fishermen would carry with them throughout the whole of their lives. They would remember. They would remember the day that they had heard the voice of God on the mountaintop, and they would reflect upon it throughout the days of their lives. But then the moment had passed. God had fallen silent once again. Moses and Elijah had returned to the past from which they came. And when the disciples looked up, they saw no one. No one but only Jesus. As that sacred moment came to an end for them, they may have had much to share with Jesus about their experience, about what they had heard and seen, about the voice of God speaking to them from that great cloud that covered them, the voice that called them to listen to him. But in that sacred moment, the disciples then fell silent, perhaps carrying their experience in the privacy of their own lives. And so for us today who gather here, this can become for us our own mountaintop experience, as we are open to that same power and presence of God within our lives through the word that we hear and the Eucharist we celebrate. It is perhaps wonderful for us to be here as well, as we encounter the transfigured Christ, who energizes and empowers us to continue our mission and our ministry for the world. But so too for us, like those 3 disciples on the mountaintop, this moment too will pass into history. And so we will then set out from this experience of encounter with our God, energized and empowered. We will set out to speak of God's kingdom at work in our lives and in our world. And it all begins with a simple call and invitation. This is my son. Listen to him.